Judge mocks nurse for wearing scrubs in court, but her response earns a standing ovation. It was a cold morning when Beverly, an ER nurse and single mother of two, rushed straight to court in Charlotte, North Carolina after an exhausting 18-hour shift. Still in her blood-stained blue scrub, she had not stopped to change. There hadn't been time, not after the night she just hours earlier she had been elbowed deep in trauma at Charlotte Memorial Hospital, working under flickering fluorescent lights in the high-pitched urgency of monitors beeping. A teenage girl had been wheeled and barely conscious, bleeding from a car wreck that left twisted steel and glass across the highway. Beverly hadn't thought twice. She had worked without food, without pause, stabilizing the girl, pressing gauze to wounds, issuing medication orders, performing compressions. That girl had a heartbeat again because of Beverly, and now the blood on her scrubs wasn't metaphor, it was memory. It was evidence of a life not lost, but none of that mattered the moment she stepped through the heavy double doors of courtroom 3C. It was 8:47 a.m. when she walked in, her sneakers frayed and flattened from years of wear squeaked slightly against the polished tile floor. Her hair was tied back hastily, a few strands falling out of a loose bun, her hospital ID still clipped to her waist. She carried no briefcase, no handbag, just the weight of the last 18 hours and the even heavier thought of losing her children. The gallery was full, attorneys, spectators, a few reporters. Even a clerk noticed her immediately, perhaps not because of who she was, but because of how she looked. She stood out, and not in the way people want to. Her ex-husband sat comfortably at the opposing table, dressed in a charcoal suit, freshly shaved and smirking. His attorney whispered something to him. He didn't look at Beverly, but the way he leaned back, relaxed, suggested he thought this part was already won. After all, she looked like she'd slept in a parking lot. 9 a.m. struck, and the judge entered. Judge Morilla, mid-60s, precise, immaculately dressed in a black robe that sat like armor over a pressed burgundy blouse, took her seat. She scanned the courtroom with the practiced swiftness of someone who had seen it all. Liars, thieves, parents pretending to be better than they were. Her eyes landed on Beverly and stayed there. There was a pause, a visible pause, one of those moments so brief it could be missed, yet long enough to freeze a room. Miss Beverly, she said at last, her tone sharp as the click of her gavel, are you under the impression that this is a hospital? Beverly stood, spine straightening, shoulders relaxing, not from confidence but from necessity. She had worked through blood-soaked shifts, screaming parents and flatline monitors. This was pressure, yes, but not panic. No, Your Honor, she replied, her voice soft but unmistakably clear. I just finished my shift. I came straight here. The judge raised a single eyebrow. This is a courtroom, she said, not a break room. You are expected to dress appropriately. This is a custody hearing, not an after-hours shift. The murmurs started in the back, low, awkward, judgmental. Some looked at Beverly with pity, others seemed embarrassed for her. Her lawyer, Jacob Fox, started to rise to intervene, but she held up a hand gently and kept her eyes on the judge. What came next wasn't rehearsed. Beverly had barely had time to breathe, let alone prepare a speech, but it came from the most honest part of her, forged by years of self-sacrifice and unrecognized work. With respect, Your Honor, Beverly began, her voice catching. Not from fear, but fatigue. These aren't pajamas. These scrubs have blood on them. Not mine, the blood of a 17-year-old girl who almost didn't make it through the night. The gallery went still. I didn't change, she continued, because I didn't have time. I didn't even go home. I made a decision. I could save a life or be 5 minutes late to change clothes for you. And then she asked the question, simple, piercing, unforgettable. She said gently, which would you prefer, saving a life or changing clothes? The silence was deafening. The air in courtroom 3C had shifted, subtle but undeniable. No one was rustling papers, no one was typing. Even the stenographer had momentarily stopped. People leaned forward slightly, as if afraid to exhale. The judge opened her mouth, perhaps to reassert control, but nothing came out. It wasn't disrespect that held Beverly's gaze steady. It was exhaustion. It was truth. It was a quiet kind of bravery that doesn't come from confrontation, but from showing up even when you don't have the energy to explain why. In the back, a young man, maybe an intern, maybe a relative, pulled out his phone. It was instinct, not planning. Something about this moment demanded to be remembered. He pressed record. The video that would go on to break the internet had just begun. Meanwhile, Beverly didn't even notice her breathing was shallow. Her hands were still marked from where tape had secured for lines. There were faint outlines on her skin from latex gloves. She didn't move with purpose. She moved from necessity. She sat down slowly, quietly. Her lawyer remained silent. There was nothing he could say that would add more to the moment. Across the room, her ex-husband looked less confident now. His smirk had dimmed, not out of guilt but confusion. This wasn't how he thought it would go. He had assumed that by presenting Beverly as tired, overwhelmed, and emotionally unavailable, the court would see a struggling woman unfit to raise 2 kids. But what they were seeing was something else. They were seeing someone who didn't just claim to care. She proved it in blood and time and sacrifice. The judge didn't respond immediately. She flipped through papers, perhaps searching for a return to order, or a reason to overlook what had just been laid bare in front of her. But order had already unraveled, not in chaos but in clarity. For once, the robe on the bench and the scrubs on the floor weren't symbols of hierarchy. They were symbols of different kinds of service, and Beverly's had just spoken louder. The courtroom was still reeling. Beverly's Words from earlier hung in the air like dust after an explosion, settling on every person, sinking deeper the more they tried to shake them off. Judge Miller hadn't said a word in several minutes. The sternness on her face hadn't vanished, but something behind her eyes had shifted, something not even her years on the bench could mask. Her fingers fidgeted subtly with the edges of her robe, her gaze normally unwavering kept returning to the nurse and Scrubs, who sat calmly unshaken by the weight of what she had just spoken into existence. And then came the next blow, silent, powerful, and utterly unexpected. "Your Honor," said Beverly's attorney Jacob Fox, rising slowly. "Before we proceed further, the defense calls a witness to testify. This was not scheduled, but she has come voluntarily compelled," she said by duty. Judge Morilla blinked, returning to her default posture of guarded professionalism. "Proceed," she said, voice quieter than before. The heavy wooden courtroom doors creaked open again. In walked a woman in her early 50s, tall and steady. A long white coat billowed behind her, but underneath she wore dark professional slacks, a navy blouse, and low heels. She wasn't dressed for effect, she was dressed to get things done. Her name carried weight at Charlotte Memorial Hospital, and now it was about to carry weight in a room where dignity was measured in legal precedent rather than human sacrifice. "Dr. Mark Jenkins," Jacob said, chief of emergency medicine. There was a pause. Whispers fluttered. A few people leaned forward, recognizing the name. Beverly blinked, shocked. She hadn't known Dr. Jenkins was coming. They hadn't spoken since she left the hospital hours ago, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline crash of saving a life and the pressure of racing against time to make it to court. The judge nodded once. "Swear the witness in." Dr. Jenkins placed her hand on the Bible and repeated the oath. She did so without hesitation, without breaking eye contact. With a baith once sworn in, she walked to the stand, not with the nervousness of someone unfamiliar with courtrooms, but with the purposeful gait of a woman used to chaos, trained to lead others through it. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, folded her hands. Jacob stepped forward. "Dr. Jenkins, how long have you worked in emergency medicine?" 28 years, she replied clearly. 15 of those as chief. "And how long have you known Beverly Witt?" 12 years, Jenkins said almost exactly. "She started as a new hire the week after her second child was born." Jacob gave a short nod. "In your professional opinion, how would you describe Nurse Witt's performance?" Jenkins turned toward the judge, now addressing her directly. "Your Honor," she said, "Beverly isn't just a nurse, she's the one I call when new nurses freeze in trauma." The words landed hard but softly, not aggressive, not showy, just truth. "She's the nurse," Jenkins continued, "who stands at the head of the table during a code and calms the room with a single look. She's the one who memorizes the names of patients others forget, and who stays late because she can't stomach the idea of someone dying alone." Jacob stepped back, allowing her the room to speak freely. She didn't hesitate. "She's missed 26 lunches this year alone," Jenkins said, "so others on the unit could take their. She volunteers to cover holidays." She held the hand of a 6-year-old boy for nearly 3 hours as he died because his parents were still driving in from Asheville. She spoke to him the entire time, told him stories about dinosaurs, saying to him, "Silence, the kind of silence that doesn't demand attention but earns it." I've seen Beverly walk out of a 10-hour shift, change out of her shoes in the parking garage, and drive across town to attend her son's school play. She's never late picking her kids up. She reads parenting books on her breaks. I once caught her teaching another nurse how to change out of scrubs in the backseat of her car in 5 minutes flat, just so she could make it to a parent-teacher conference on time. The judge swallowed hard. "No gavel, no interruptions." She didn't wear scrubs today to make a point. Jenkins said she wore them because she was needed at 3:41 this morning. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble, it simply carried the kind of gravity that doesn't require force. There was a 17-year-old girl brought in by paramedics, massive trauma, chest not rising, pupils sluggish. The team hesitated only for a split second. But in trauma, that's all it takes, and Beverly stepped forward. She didn't ask. She led. She inserted a chest tube, administered emergency medication, ordered imaging, called the girl's name over and over until the monitors stopped their alarms and showed a rhythm. Jenkins reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper, a letter, she said, written this morning by the girl's parents. They were still in the waiting room when Beverly left for court. They found out why she had to go and handed me this to read. She unfolded the paper. The courtroom leaned into whom it may concern, she read, voice slightly tight. If Beverly Witt had not stayed past her shift, our daughter would not be breathing. Give her children back. She's earned them 100 times over. You could hear someone sniffle in the gallery. A tissue rustled. A young woman near the back dabbed her eyes. Even a clerk paused as typing, visibly stunned. Judge Morilla leaned back in her chair. Her posture was still upright but not rigid. Her eyes blinked once slowly. Dr. Jenkins folded the letter and handed it to the court clerk, who approached the bench. "This is what I wanted you to know," Jenkins said. "There are people who show up to work, and then there are people who show up for life. Beverly Witt does both." Jacob stepped forward again, but not to speak, only to place a hand lightly on the edge of the witness stand in a gesture of silent thanks. He nodded. Dr. Jenkins stood and stepped down. Beverly watched her as she passed. Their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The judge cleared her throat. The sound echoed louder than expected. There was no courtroom drama to Cut through, no objections, no raised voices, just the heavy silence of realization of a narrative being rewritten in real time. It wasn't just the testimony, it was how it contrasted with what the courtroom had assumed just an hour earlier. That blood-stained nurse, flustered and unfashionable, had walked in unnoticed. Except to be mocked. No, she was something else, someone else, a man in a pressed grey suit near the back row, clearly from the opposing counsel's office, removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Discreetly, Judge Morilla glanced at Beverly, then quickly looked away, as if doing so too long might break her composure. She didn't speak, her gavel remained untouched, and that was what made it so loud. The gavel hadn't even struck for recess when the courtroom erupted, not in noise but in tension, the kind that makes people forget to stand. Judge Mellor had quietly called for a break, yet no one moved right away. Some sat stunned, others stared at Beverly as if they were only now seeing her for the first time. Beverly exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale you release after holding everything together longer than anyone should have to. She gathered herself with the dignity of someone who hadn't expected to make headlines only to be heard, and then with her lawyer by her side she stood and made her way toward the exit. The wooden doors groaned open to a blinding flood of light and camera flashes outside. The world had changed. There were reporters now, dozens of them, huddled near the courthouse steps. Microphones were angled forward, boom mics hovered overhead, photographers clicked in unison like a mechanical storm. It hadn't even been 3 hours since the young man inside had uploaded that short, trembling video clip of Beverly standing in scrubs and asking the judge, "Which would you prefer, saving a life or changing clothes?" It didn't just go viral, it detonated. By now the video had racked up millions of views across platforms. #Beverly with #scrubs in court, #respect the uniform, and #momencrubs were all trending simultaneously on Twitter, TikTok, and even LinkedIn. The comments were flooded with nurses, first responders, single mothers, exhausted fathers, and strangers from around the world typing one word again and again: respect. Jacob placed a steady hand on Beverly's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, stepping slightly in front of her as reporters surged forward. Beverly nodded, but didn't speak. She wasn't dazed by attention, just disconnected from it all. Of this buzz, this noise felt unreal. She wasn't here to go viral. She hadn't even seen the clip. She had just tried to survive one more day. Now she was in the eye of a media storm she didn't ask for. The strange thing was she wasn't alone. A slow but growing crowd had gathered on the courthouse lawn, nurses and scrubs, EMTs still wearing reflective jackets, firefighters with ash on their uniforms. Some had just finished shifts, others had left midship. A few clutch signs made from cardboard and duct tape scrolled in Sharpie with messages like, "We stand with Beverly, real heroes wear scrubs." She showed up, so did we. One nurse stood near the center. She was older, early 60s maybe, and wore deep blue scrubs and Crocs. Around her neck hung a stethoscope and a laminated ID tag. She held no sign, just stood there with arms crossed, eyes wet but proud. Beverly spotted her and paused. Their eyes met, and without words, something passed between them, an understanding, a kind of salute. She was not alone anymore inside. However, things were far quieter, yet no less seismic. Judge Morilla sat in her chambers, the oak pan-led walls towering above her. Sunlight spilled through the blinds and pale stripes landing across the transcript she held in her lap. She wasn't reading it as a judge now, she was reading it as a mother. She had one son, grown now, living across the country. She remembered the nights she stayed late in chambers chasing promotion and president while someone else picked him up from school. She remembered how she used to equate effort with sacrifice, but always the kind that came in suits and ruled by schedules. She had never once had to save someone's life and then justify her appearance to a courtroom. Beverly's words echoed in her head: "I didn't choose between my job and my children. I chose to be the kind of mother I'd want to show up if my child ever needed saving." The sentence hit her like nothing else had in years. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't defiant, it was just real, and in its reality it humbled her. For all her years in law, all her courtroom decorum and legal lectures, she hadn't recognized that what Beverly wore that morning wasn't disrespect, it was service, and Mellor had almost dismissed it as sloppiness. She stared at the transcript, each line now read like a confession, not of guilt but of truth the court had tried to overlook. Judge Mellor rubbed the bridge of her nose, trying to push away the burning behind her eyes, but there was no one hearing what had been said, no one seeing the crowd now gathering outside her building. The moment she stood from her chair, the air seemed to shift in the chambers. She walked back toward the courtroom alone, no assistants, no clerks, just her robe and the weight of a decision that was no longer about evidence alone, but about acknowledging what everyone in the world already saw. The courtroom doors opened once again. This time, when Judge Mellor stepped through, she saw them, a wall of health care workers lining the back of the courtroom, silent, still standing in solidarity. Beverly, unaware of the viral reaction still unfolding outside, was seated once more with Jacob, her head tilted slightly to the side as she scanned the growing crowd. People were cramming into every row of the gallery, standing along the walls, even sitting on the steps. It wasn't chaos, it was reverence. Some were dressed in suits, others wore scrubs, some wore badges from local hospitals. One young paramedic had clearly just come off a call, his hands still stained with iodine. Beverly turned to Jacob. "What is all this?" she whispered. Jacob didn't smile, he just said this: This is what truth does. When Judge Miller sat at the bench, she paused. No rustling of papers, no tapping of gavels, just a long, quiet scan of the faces before her. This room no longer belonged to her, it belonged to something bigger. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. No longer sharp, no longer guarded. It was the voice of a woman who had been forced to reckon with something deeper than law. Before we proceed, she began, this court would like to acknowledge a statement made earlier today. The gallery held its breath. She looked directly at Beverly. Miss Witt, she said, you told this court that you didn't choose between your job and your children. You chose to be the kind of mother who would show up if your child ever needed saving. A pause. That line, the judge said softly, stayed with me. You could feel the room inhale as one. This courtroom has always prided itself on maintaining decorum, she continued. But today I was reminded that true decorum is not about attire. It is not about surface. It is about sacrifice, quiet, unpolished, unglamorous sacrifice. Her voice didn't crack, but it came close. And what you demonstrated, Miss Witt, in the uniform I once disrespected was precisely that. Not a whisper moved across the room. Let the record reflect, the judge said clearly. This court recognizes that strength does not always wear suits. Sometimes it wears scrubs, sometimes it walks in late, and sometimes it saves a life before showing up here. Beverly sat frozen, not stunned, just deeply still, like someone who had been gasping for air and finally breathed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of correction, of recognition. Not a gavel was lifted, not a protest was made. The courtroom stood still, not in fear but in reverence. The Ovation courtroom 3C was unlike any that had come before, not one born of fear or formality, but of gravity, the kind that comes when something historic is about to happen and everyone knows it. Jacob Fox, Beverly's lawyer, stood slowly. The usual cadence of final arguments didn't follow. No summaries, no pleas, no carefully rehearsed lines delivered for effect. He looked at Judge Morilla with the calm resolve of a man who knew words couldn't compete with truth. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but full. My client already gave her closing statement. Through her actions he didn't point toward Beverly. He didn't need to. Everyone in that room knew who he was talking about. A beat of silence. Then Jacob sat back down, and for a brief moment all eyes turned to the other side of the courtroom. L. Grant, a man known for sharp rhetoric and colder victories, shifted in his chair, his usually polished demeanor impenetrable and practiced now showed cracks. He looked across the room at Beverly, who sat still in her scrubs, blood faintly visible, her ID badge still clipped to her hip. No makeup, no gloss, just real. Grant stood. For a second everyone assumed the counterattack was coming, a softened rebuttal maybe, or redirect, but instead he spoke quieter than expected. Your Honor, he began, his voice lacking its typical edge, I withdraw my closing statement. That alone was enough to draw murmurs from the gallery. But then he did something almost no one had seen him do in his career. He looked directly at the woman he'd been hired to dismantle and said, Miss Witt, I was wrong. No dramatic pause, no attempt to salvage his case. Wrong to assume you weren't fit, wrong to think that dedication to your job meant negligence toward your children. I've represented dozens of custody cases. This is the first time I felt ashamed doing it. The room was silent again, this time heavier. Beverly didn't react. No smile, no shock, just stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when you've spent years fighting battles no one saw and suddenly someone surrenders on their own. Judge Morilla adjusted her glasses. I have reached a decision, she announced, and every shoulder in the room stiffened. She didn't read from a script. She didn't check notes. Full physical and legal custody, she said, shall remain with Miss Beverly Witt. The words landed like a release valve opening. There is no evidence, legal or moral, that suggests these children would be better served elsewhere. In fact, this court finds overwhelming evidence of consistency, emotional stability, and parental devotion. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Miss Witt, the judge continued, now looking directly at her, what you demonstrated in this courtroom was not just fitness to parent, it was the embodiment of sacrifice, strength, and clarity of purpose. And then Judge Morilla did something no one expected. She leaned slightly forward and added, from this day forward, nurses appearing in this courtroom after a shift will be offered water, not warnings. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of reporters' pins freezing mid-sentence, and then a single clap, soft from the middle of the gallery, then another, until the room erupted, not in chaos, but in thunderous applause. Every person, nurses, paramedics, clerks, strangers, rose to their feet. The gallery surged to life, not for a verdict, but for a woman who had come to court not with a suit and a speech, but with blood on her sleeves and courage in her eyes. The sound of it filled every corner of the room, echoing off the walls, spilling out into the hallway where the crowd of healthcare workers outside could hear it through the doors. Tears slipped silently down cheeks. A young nurse in the back dabbed her eyes with a tissue she'd been gripping since morning. A firefighter standing near the exit placed a hand over his batch. Even one of the court clerks, who'd remained composed all day, blinked twice to clear her vision. Beverly stood slowly, not with pride but with reverence. She didn't raise her hand, she didn't bask in the applause, she just stood the way she had in trauma base, beside hospital beds, and now in a courtroom where she had just redefined what strength looked like. Judge Miller, now visibly moved, didn't strike her gavel to silence the room. She let the applause wash through like rain over dry land, because this moment didn't belong to law, it belonged to truth, and in that moment the courtroom stood for her, not just the nurses or the witnesses or even the lawyers. The whole room standing ovation, not for victory but for visibility, for the mother who saved a life at 4 a.m. and walked into court in scrubs at 8:47 a.m. not to make a point, but because she couldn't afford to waste time proving she cared. She already had. When the applause faded, Beverly sat back down, not triumphant but grateful. Her fight for custody, for credibility, for dignity was over, but her impact that was just beginning. By the time the courtroom had emptied and the wooden doors finally shut behind her, Beverly Witt thought the noise might stop. She was wrong, because while courtroom 3C fell quiet, the rest of the world had just begun to speak her name. Within 24 hours, clips of Beverly's soft-spoken courtroom defense had taken over every platform imaginable. #Respect the Scrubs was trending in 17 countries. #Beverly Witt Day appeared on banners, profile headers and protest signs. Her quote, "Would you prefer I saved a life or changed clothes?" became the heartbeat of a movement. Beverly had never wanted to be known. She hadn't walked into that courtroom in scrubs to make a statement. She had walked in because she was out of time and out of clean clothes, and her priority had been clear: save a life first, fight for her kids next. She didn't even know she'd gone viral until she got to the hospital 2 days later and found dozens of printed screenshots tacked to the bulletin board in the staff lounge. Some were memes, some were quotes, others were just screenshots of the moment she had looked the judge in the eye and refused to apologize for saving someone else's child. Beverly stood in front of the board silently, still holding her coffee, her bag slung over one shoulder. One of the new nurses, young and eager, came up behind her and said, "We're proud of you." "Oh." She laughed softly. "I'm not that old." "You are now," the nurse replied with a grin. "You're a legend." And maybe she was for the world, but at home Beverly was still just mom. She still folded laundry at midnight, still helped her daughter practice spelling list with flashcards over reheated pasta. She still worked her night shifts like clockwork, never late, never loud. That was the part no one televised. No headlines declared Beverly folds 3 loads of towels while listening to her son's science project. No push notifications announced that she fell asleep on the couch holding a juice box for her daughter. But it was in those small, unfiltered moments that her real legacy was cemented. Still, the world didn't stop knocking. There were interview requests. Oprah, Anderson Cooper, 60 Minutes, Good Morning America. Everyone wanted a piece of her. A book deal offer came from a major publishing house. A documentary pitch was sent to her hospital's HR department. TED Talk invitations, local speaking gigs, keynote offers at national nursing conferences poured into her inbox daily, but Beverly turned most of them down. When asked why, she always said the same thing: "I'm not trying to be a voice, I'm trying to be present." It wasn't about being silent, it was about staying grounded. Fame, attention, applause, those things didn't get kids to school. They didn't hold your hand when you woke up crying from exhaustion at 2 a.m. They didn't wait patiently when you were called into a shift on your day off. But one call came that wasn't about lights or cameras. It was from the State Museum of American Labor and Service. A woman named Carla Boone, curator of the National Uniform Exhibit, reached Beverly's voicemail with a soft, deliberate message: "Miss, we would like to request the scrubs you wore to court. We believe they belong next to the firefighter boots from 9/11 and the miner's helmet from Appalachia. What you wore wasn't just fabric, it was proof that real service isn't always polished, it just shows up." Beverly listened to the message 3 times. Before responding, she went to her room, opened her dresser, and pulled out the folded scrubs, still faintly stained. Still holding the sin of hospital-grade sanitizer, adrenaline, and a courtroom's worth of truth, she pressed her palm against the folded top and let herself sit in silence, and then quietly she placed them in a box. No fanfare, no announcement, just a handwritten note inside: "I didn't wear these to prove a point, I wore them because someone needed me." Weeks later, the exhibit opened with her scrubs displayed under glass. A bronze plaque beside them read, "The scrubs that showed up, worn by Beverly Wood after an 18-hour shift at Charlotte Memorial Hospital during a custody hearing that reshaped national dialogue." She didn't shout, she didn't perform, she just showed up, tired, real, and unshaken. The exhibit drew thousands in its first week. Teachers brought classrooms, field trips were organized. A high school history teacher in Chicago launched a curriculum unit titled Modern Courage, the people who didn't yell but changed everything. And that might have been the end of it, but then came the WIT standard, proposed quietly at first by a bipartisan group of lawmakers. The WIT standard was a resolution ensuring that frontline workers, especially healthcare professionals, could not be penalized or barred for appearing in court in uniform directly after work. It passed in 3 states within its first month. Judges across the country updated court decorum policies. One even said from the bench, "The robe gives me the power to judge, but not to shame someone who just saved a life." Across the nation, people were listening, and back in Charlotte, something special happened. The mayor issued a proclamation on live television in recognition of unwavering dedication to service, strength, and humanity. The City of Charlotte officially renames Nurses Day to Beverly Witt Day at home. Beverly was making breakfast when her daughter came running into the kitchen waving a school flyer they named a day. "After you," she cried, eyes wide with excitement. Beverly looked at the paper, saw her name in bold print, then looked back at her daughter. "No, honey," she said with a soft smile. "They named it after what people like me do. We show up. We don't wait to be perfect, we just go." Later that morning, Beverly zipped her daughter's backpack and placed a kiss on her forehead, her ID badge clipped to her hip, her scrubs pressed clean, simple blue. Unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they had survived. Her daughter paused before stepping outside. "Will they remember you?" she asked. Beverly knelt, looked her child in the eyes, and replied, "Maybe not my name, but they'll remember what we stood for." Outside the school, crossing guard raised a hand, ushering students forward. The wind moved through the trees with a quiet rustle. The morning sun lit the sidewalk and golden strips of warmth. And Beverly Witt, just a nurse, just a mother, just a woman who once had to choose between showing up clean or showing up at all, stood by the door in scrubs, still tired, still steady, still showing up. The day after the mayor's announcement, local businesses throughout Charlotte began placing signs in their windows: "We honor Beverly Witt Day. Nurses eat free." Cafes offered free coffee. A bookstore set up a front table display with memoirs written by medical professionals and included a handwritten note to those who show up tired and still give everything. "This shelf is yours." Children began asking their teachers about the woman in scrubs who stood up to a judge in classrooms from Charlotte to Cincinnati. Stories of Beverly's court hearing were read aloud, not for drama, but for example. Middle schoolers wrote essays titled "Why I Want to Be Like Beverly Witt." One little boy stood at career day wearing his mother's extra pair of scrubs. When asked who he wanted to be, he said the nurse that made the courtroom clap. Meanwhile, Beverly tried to keep life as normal as possible. She still used coupons at the grocery store. She still double-checked her kids' homework. She still drove a slightly rusted minivan that rattled when it hit potholes. She would wave politely when people recognized her at stoplights or in waiting rooms, but she rarely stopped. She had patients to care for. She had bedtime routines to protect, and the spotlight, while well-intentioned, was never her goal, but sometimes it came to her anyway. One evening she walked into a small urgent care center to get her son's ankle checked after a soccer game. The receptionist stood up the moment she saw her and said, "You don't need to wait, we'll see you right now." When Beverly tried to protest, the woman just smiled. "You waited for everyone else, now it's our turn." Another time she found a small package in her mailbox, no return address inside, a folded nurse's cap, a handwritten letter, and a charm bracelet engraved with one word, anchor. The note read, "You reminded us who we are. You're the anchor for your children, for your patients, for all of us who forgot we could speak gently and still shake the world." Beverly tucked the letter into a shoebox of memories she kept in her closet right next to the kindergarten drawings and old patient thank you cards. She didn't share those moments online. She didn't post them. She just held them close, the way someone holds warmth on a cold day, quiet, precious, and enough. One rainy Tuesday morning, Beverly was walking her daughter to school. The sky was gray, the pavement slick with puddles. Her daughter, holding a polka dot umbrella and wearing rain boots, looked up and asked a question that caught Beverly mid-step. "Mom," she said, "when I grow up, can I wear scrubs too?" Beverly smiled, adjusted the little girl's backpack, and knelt to meet her eyes. "You can wear whatever you want, baby," she said, "but just make sure you show up for the people who need you." That was the thing about legacy. It didn't need spotlights, it needed footsteps, conversations, little girls with bright eyes asking big questions under rainy skies. As they crossed the street, the crossing guard tipped his hat at Beverly. "Thank you for what you did," he said. Simply, Beverly nodded, then turned her gaze back to the school door ahead. Still a nurse, still a mother, still showing up. And behind her, the world, still watching, still remembering, stood just a little taller because of it. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell more inspiring stories like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you feel about how Beverly Witt's journey unfolded? What do you think of Judge Mellor's transformation and how Jacob Fox stood by Beverly with quiet strength from beginning to end? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What part of the story touched you the most? How would you rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10? And let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Thank you for being part of this story. Let's continue to honor those who show up even when the world isn't watching.